A very warm welcome to this webinar. It's another exciting webinar in a long series of green webinars we have been organizing during the last month. This one is probably the largest webinar at daylight we have done so far, and it shows this conference comes at the right time, but in particular with the right speakers, and therefore it's great to have you here. I only would like to say hello. We had more than 1,100 registrations, which is just exciting. And of course, this is because the question of the green transition of the chemical industry, or what we call in German, the Chemiewende, is a cornerstone of the Green Deal. We are expecting the green chemical strategy of the Commission, and therefore we will have a really interesting debate. We will also present our own action plan for this, and I'm proud to having organized this with Jutta Paulus, who will moderate this conference. She has been active in the sector herself, and therefore she knows in particular well what we all talk about. And I only would like to say that this webinar will be recorded. So when later on you will raise your voice, and of course you have also the possibility to ask questions, please be aware that you will be recorded, and make transparent who you are and whom you perhaps represent. Beyond that, we will have interesting speeches, and we encourage you to tweet and with other means on social media, spread what has been said here. So if you found something exciting, inspirational, please share it and make sure that this webinar is seen, and spread, if you like, also the link for more people to even join us. And for all participants, it is of course possible to make raise your own questions. Please do so by using the FAQ function, which is available to you and will be visible to all panelists. And by this way, we can try to address your question. But I also invite you to share comments and feedback with us on what you have been hearing, because not everyone will be able to speak. So by that way, you make sure that we learn about it. And now look forward to an exciting webinar, and for Jutta to take over.
Yes, thank you, Sven. Welcome from my side too. I'm very happy to see that there is so much interest in this topic, which is not so close to many people's hearts, actually. As Sven has already said, the chemical industry is key for the Green Deal. One could call the chemical industry to be part of the problem, but also be part of the solution. And it's very clear that we need a transition, and that Europe has the chance to become a front runner again in chemical industry after having shored a lot of production to other countries and continents. It is not only pollution and hazardous substances which we have to tackle, it's also the energy demand, the use of fossil resources. We need efficiency gains. We need to phase out not only pollutant chemicals, but also polluting production processes. So I'm very glad to have perceived that Commission is taking this task very seriously and will present a chemical strategy to address all these issues. And we are very much honored that Commissioner Sinkevičius is with us today and will give a keynote for us and take part in the debate later on. And I would like to briefly introduce our high-level guests, which is Minister Carole Dieschbourg from Luxembourg, which is the Director of the European Chemicals Agency, Bjorn Hansen. Then we have Frida from the NGO ChemSec. I think it's the only NGO that really is looking at chemistry as a whole. And we have Sylvie Lemoine, who is co-chair of CEFIC, which is the European Association of chemical industry. Thank you very much for making this possible and for giving us the honor to be with us and giving input to our audience, which has grown quite a bit in the last minutes. I can see it on my panel here. I'm really excited to have you all and looking forward to a very interesting debate. But first, please, Commissioner, we're very, very happy to have you. Thanks so much for making it possible, and go ahead, the floor is yours.
Mute myself. Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. First of all, of course, I probably have to welcome you after the summer break, and I'm happy we straight away diving into a very important topic, which I think is going to be at the center of attention for quite a while this autumn. You know that chemicals they serve a myriad of purposes. Those purposes, in the end of the day, they make our lives more comfortable, easier, cleaner, and very clear that no thousands of new chemicals are designed every day. Generally, the intentions are good for better products, better services, more efficient production, and etc. Unfortunately, reality is that also many chemicals are hazardous by nature and may lead to irreversible damage to humans and the environment, and their accumulation and combined impacts are putting at risk not only current but also future generations. European Union's policy approach has been to offer the highest level of protection of human health and the environment, while of course stimulating innovation and competitiveness of the European industry. Those two intertwined objectives are enshrined in our existing legislation and have driven EU research and innovation funding in the area of chemicals. And in the past years, the European Commission has assessed whether our tools are effective in reaching those objectives. And the evaluations show that indeed we have the most advanced and protective chemicals policy in the world. However, many alarming trends show that it is not sufficient to fulfill our objectives, and I will enumerate a few. First of all, a growing number of hazardous substances are found in ecosystems as well as in human blood, including children, and they are associated with increasing diseases and biodiversity loss. And according to the latest Eurobarometer, 90% of citizens are worried about the impact of chemicals present in everyday products. Secondly, the share of chemicals on the EU market that are hazardous to health and the environment. Even of the most hazardous substances has not been declining in the past decade. The expected shift to greener chemistry is not happening fast enough. And thirdly, chemical production worldwide is expected to double by the end of 2030. So this means harm to humans and the environment would only exacerbate if adequate policy measures are not in place. So overall, the world is failing to meet the 2020 target for the sound management of chemicals enshrined in the Sustainable Development Goals. So we need to step up action to fulfill this goal. And this is why the Commission has committed in the European Green Deal to come forward with a chemical strategy for sustainability as part of an overall zero pollution ambition for a toxic-free environment. The Green Deal has clearly defined that key objectives of this strategy should be to protect citizens and the environment better against hazardous chemicals and encourage innovation for the development of safe and sustainable alternatives. With the ongoing COVID-19 crisis, I think this strategy has become even more important. First of all, because it has become more evident that some chemicals are essential for the good functioning of our society, for example, for producing pharmaceuticals, and the strategy can contribute to strengthening EU strategic autonomy for those essential chemicals. Secondly, of course, exposure to hazardous chemicals increases our vulnerability to diseases, for instance, by affecting our immune and respiratory systems, and so protecting from hazardous chemicals is therefore key to strengthen humans' resilience to health crises. And finally, the strategy will give a crucial contribution to the EU's economic and social recovery and to the green transition, of course. So the strategy will propose a mix of regulatory and non-regulatory instruments to achieve a long-term vision where safe and sustainable chemicals become the default options to the benefit of the people, the planet, and the economy. And therefore, the title of this conference is very well, I think, chosen. And we will not change the status quo without a systemic transformation of the way we produce and use chemicals. And in this regard, I would like to stress 5 points on how this transition can be achieved. First of all, the transformation needs stronger legislation. And despite the achievements of EU chemicals legislations, which we are proud of, not all citizens are protected equally, and not all chemical risks are addressed. Regulation is an important driver to change, and we urgently need to step up action, both in implementing and enforcing existing legislation, but also close regulatory gaps, in particular to address endocrine disruptors, the combined effects of chemicals, and to tackle persistent substances such as PFAS. Secondly, we need to encourage safe and sustainable innovation, and thereby ensure the competitiveness of sustainable industry. Despite our best efforts, substitution of hazardous substances has not happened at the required pace, and we need to carefully reflect at how we improve this. Frontrunners, those who produce and use chemicals more safely and sustainably, they still encounter barriers, including economic and technical barriers. And Europe has the scientific and technical capacity to lead the transition to safe chemical and non-chemical alternatives from design to end of life, but a joint effort of all actors and adequate instruments are needed. Thirdly, we need to simplify our regulatory processes and achieve coherence across policy objectives and legislation, so to ensure that rules are clear, effective, and they do not create trade-offs in the end of the day. This is extremely relevant for both the climate and circular economy agenda, because research efficiency will not be met if we don't also ensure non-toxic material cycles and therefore clean material loops. Fourth, we need more and better knowledge on chemicals so that authorities, industry, consumers, they can make informed choices. We need more data on the volumes and the uses of chemicals placed on the market, and more research to understand their fate and impacts on humans and the environment. But we also need better skills at all levels to turn this knowledge into practice and inform decisions of all actors. Finally, if we want chemicals to be safe and sustainable, we cannot stop here at the European borders. We need the EU to become more and more example worldwide on the sound management of chemicals through our legislation, as well as the way our industry operates, raising international standards and, of course, supporting third countries to put in place mechanisms, rules, infrastructures for ensuring the same level of protection. The chemical strategy is now under preparation by the Commission services, building also on extensive inputs received by a vast number of stakeholders, and it is expected for adoption this autumn. The adoption of the strategy will, however, not be the end of the process. After the adoption, there is the hardest part. We will need to implement and to follow it up with relevant legislative and non-legislative initiatives. And it is a long journey that will require the participation and commitment of all actors. Let me finalize by saying that protecting our planet and our shared environment is our generation's defining task. And I think it is an urgent moral, human, and political obligation which Europeans have resoundingly told us they want their union to fulfill. And it is also a long-term economic imperative. Those who act first and fastest, I believe they will be the ones who grasp the opportunities from the ecological transition.
Thank you, Commissioner, for this very inspiring speech, and we are looking forward to the chemical strategy being published in autumn. I think European Parliament has already a bit set the scene with the resolution which was adopted before the summer break. Before I give the floor to my colleague Sven, who will elaborate on our green ideas for a sustainable transformation of the chemical industry, I would just like to briefly say something. A lot of people are wondering why Saori Dubourg from BASF, who was originally announced as panelist, is not here with us. Unfortunately, there was an appointment coming up within her organization where she could not be absent. So we're very glad that Sylvie Lemoine from CEFIC could take her place, and I believe that she can very well give us an account of the industry's view of the chemical strategy. CEFIC is representing more than 500 industrial companies of the chemical industry, so I'm sure we will not have to miss the industrial perspective. Sorry for this interruption, Sven. You would like to present our causes, our topics, our issues, and please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jutta. Before that conference and also in a run-up to the parliamentary resolution, which we adopted before the summer, we have developed our own action plan for the green transition of the chemical industry, transformation for people and planet. I just shared the link to the written version, and we welcome, of course, very much any feedback. I would like to present the key points of what we suggest. So we believe that chemical policy is very much part of industrial policy. As speaking for the German Greens, we have seen that we lost competitive edge in some key industries in the past. In the automotive industry, we are not the leaders for clean cars. When we look to the largest energy companies in Germany, they were not giving up on coal and nuclear early enough, and now we have leaders from other parts in the world. When it comes to sustainable chemicals, Europe has a stronger legislative framework than anybody else, and what happened with automotive may not happen with our chemical industry. The chemical industry stands for 1.2 million jobs, and therefore the question how to address the green transformation is a question for people, for our health, for our environment, but equally a question of our industrial future and of economic interests. And that we keep these two objectives in mind so that Europe remains and the global leader in sustainable and clean chemicals. So therefore we welcome, of course, that the Green Deal strategy of the European Commission has understood that link, as the Commissioner has just indicated. But before speaking about what else to do in the future, it is absolutely critical that we first apply and enforce the existing legislation. So REACH is already in place, but it is often not properly applied. The REACH principle of no data, no market should be refined towards a principle of no proper data, no market. It is not acceptable that the dossiers are not complete, that they are not filled as they should be. And equally, we find forbidden chemicals still in everyday lives products. It is also equally, we find dangerous chemicals in our water systems, despite the obligations of the Water Framework Directive. And therefore, it is important that the Commission audits the enforcement systems in the member states and prioritize to open obvious cases of infringement procedures without delays. Equally, ECHA must be equipped in a way that it is able to fulfill the ambition of the REACH framework. Second, it is critical to ensure the phasing out of fossil fuels and fossil raw materials. The chemical industry must contribute its fair share to the EU's climate neutrality by 2050, the latest. So this means the energy and the resource base has to be shifted, and hydrogen as replacement for fossil gas must be produced from renewable sources. Commission and member states should make effective use of economic instruments to incentivize climate neutral and sustainable products and clean production, for example, by fees and environmental taxes. Where fossil raw materials are substituted by bio-based feedstock, a life cycle analysis is needed to ensure sustainability. We need to set benchmarks for efficient production and use through best available techniques. It is equally important, thirdly, to ensure upstream and downstream producer responsibility. So we need to adopt a European due diligence law, so ein Lieferkettengesetz for the German speakers, to cover supply chain management. Producers must be accountable for human rights, labor standards along the whole supply chains, and hazardous substances that are prohibited in Europe must not be exported to other countries. Fourthly, we need to substitute hazardous substances wherever possible. For this, it is unacceptable that at birth, every third baby in the EU is poisoned with methyl mercury levels above the current legal limit. We must implement a toxic-free hierarchy of measures that follows the principle of safe and sustainable by design. For this also, it is important that all relevant currently known substances of very high concern must be included on the candidate list under REACH by the end of this year. Cocktail effects of chemicals must be addressed by implementing a mixture allocation factor in Annex 1 of REACH. The upcoming revision of the EU Toy Directive must be used to ensure children are better protected from all hazardous substances. All relevant legislation must also be revised to ensure the safety for all applications of nanomaterials and products with potential health, environmental, or safety impact over their life cycle based on adequate tests. Fifth, we need to adopt REACH Plus. Beyond what I've said on rigorous implementation, we need to close dangerous loopholes, fully address plastics in the framework, and adopt an early warning system for new hazards. It is, for this, we also need to extend the fast-track procedure for consumer use of all substances of very high concern and add substances that are persistent, mobile, or toxic, or very persistent and very mobile to the substances of very high concern, and to ensure the adequate assessment of complex substances. I will summarize, of course, all the points. You find the details later. It is, sixthly, important to speed up and streamline the regulatory process and to avoid new paralysis by analysis. I think it is very important that the one substance, one assessment principle can avoid duplication of work. Risks, however, must be addressed and managed depending on the respective use and exposure. Therefore, we should not formalize the regulatory management option analysis, the famous RMAO, as this would only lead to paralysis by analysis. As a priority, however, the Commission should adopt an action plan as indicated by the Commissioner for PFAS, with the goal to phase out the use of all 4,700 plus PFAS, the so-called forever chemicals, allowing only for essential uses. Equally, the scope and use of generic risk assessment should be extended. Common hazard-based criteria for endocrine disruptors should be defined and adopted across all relevant pieces of legislation as a basis for effective action to minimize exposure. 7, we need to speed up the transition towards a clean and toxic-free circular economy. Instead of extract, make, use, throw away, we need to reuse precious resources in order to relieve pressure on the environment and the climate. Reducing dependency on import, save costs for extraction and transport, and stop polluting the planet with plastic waste. And therefore, the EU needs to establish a non-toxic material cycle. The principle should be toxic out and then recycle. And obviously for this, it is needed to keep toxic out of the whole process in order to avoid accumulation. It is critical that we also ensure that in particular the key technology of battery has to be they have to be recycled, and the respective obligations have to be made on the European market, in particular with a view to electric vehicles. Therefore, eighthly, we need to ensure transparency and empower consumers to make safe and smart choices. Toxic-free and low-resource chemicals which are produced under fair conditions can be facilitated through greater transparency. Therefore, established based on existing information, such as the SCIP database, a user-friendly public information system on hazardous substances present in materials and articles, for instance, through mobile applications with an app. Ninth, we need to ensure that EU chemicals law is an integral part of industrial policy to foster smart innovation. The transformation of chemical industry is an opportunity to boost investment in future-proof technologies. European policies on sustainability are part of industrial strategy so that safe and sustainable chemistry made in Europe can remain competitive and secure the 1.2 million jobs in the European chemical industry. We must invest in research and education, digitalization, SMEs, and new business models to incentivize safe and sustainable chemicals made in Europe. And lastly, we need to ensure a level playing field for all. And this means that products which may not be manufactured in Europe may not be imported. Loopholes in this regard have to be closed, and therefore it would be a high time to establish an adequate testing of products. The Commission should make use of the powers granted under the Market Surveillance Regulation to set minimum standards for the amount of samples, frequency, and conditions of the checks performed by the national authorities. we must make sure that breaches of EU rules must lead to adequate sanctions. This is essential in order to ensure that REACH's leading role for ambitious chemicals legislation is not undermined. So these are our key points, and we are welcoming your feedback, and we are looking forward to opening from our and continuing this discussion. We are absolutely determined to push Jutta and myself and the Green Group and the Greens in Germany to push forward with this agenda for a European Chemiewende. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sven, for this presentation of our principles. And Sven has already posted the link to the English version of this action plan, which he has already published on his homepage. And we, of course, will do a German translation for a German-speaking audience too. Well, we have now heard the Commissioner's perspective, the Greens' perspective, and I'm very happy to introduce Carole Dieschbourg, who will give us the member states' perspective as environmental minister of the founding state of the European Union, which is Luxembourg, our neighbor country. From where I live, it's about 2 hours per train to come to Luxembourg. So I might visit you someday, Carole, which would be very nice when all this is over. Thank you. Go ahead, you have the floor.
Thank you, Jutta, and you're very welcome. So a warm greetings from Luxembourg to everyone. Distinguished Commissioner, thank you for the inspiring speech, but also Sven, thank you for giving us now some push in order to take up the part of the ambition in the member state level. Because one thing is very sure, it's urgent need to action. We all know in this room that we have to step up ambition. We have to do more for implementation, but the most important thing, and therefore I may really thank you and congratulate you for the format that you have chosen, is that we all work together, not only the member states and the Commission and the Parliament, in order to step up the ambition on the framework, which will push innovation. Because we experienced this in Europe over the last 15 years with an ambitious REACH legislation, that we can set standards, we are able to protect people, and now we have to take the next steps and choose the opportunity that is given now with the Green Deal, with an ambitious Commission to do what people expect from us. Because if you look at what people, European citizens, expect from us, it's to protect their health. And this is even more visible now in the COVID crisis. So taking us together not only as politicians, but also including civil society by having NGO sector, but also to have the industry sector to go for the same direction. This will be crucial if we want to have better chemical policies in Europe, and I'm convinced that everyone goes into the right direction. And of course, we need our agencies, we need to give them the financial support that they need in order to give us the right database in order to make us push. And I think this is crucial to have everyone on board, and that coherencies and synergies between all levels on European scale, on worldwide scale, but really also between the actors, industry, NGOs and politicians. That's how we designed also the Paris Agreement. That's during the last years that we have been taking these big steps into the direction of climate neutral and into a pollution-free world. And that's what we want to do. So increased implementation, let's come back to this. And being fit for future and being fit for the purpose is really the main priority that people are expecting us. So we should build on the good practices, on existing instruments at the European level. We should build on the experience of European agencies to promote ambitious standards in Europe, but also on a worldwide level, in order to show that it is possible to have a competitive industry, but also high standards. So I think I'm really looking forward to Commission's proposal. As I heard Commissioner, he seems to be very ambitious on the side of the environmental part. Now let's build alliances to also work with competitive, with growth, with industry in order to fulfill what we want to do. We have to build on the knowledge that we already have, but it's really increased ambition that we need and immediate implementation. And also we have to tackle the current and existing weaknesses that have already been highlighted by some of you before, especially if it comes to the many hazardous chemicals that cause significant damages to health and to environment. So we have to get rid of some of those very toxic substances. And I think, which is absolutely needed, Commissioner, is really that we accelerate the substitution and the phase out of chemicals of high concern, and to really take those steps now until the end of the years. And I think it's really important that politicians work for ambitious outcome if it comes to endocrine disruptor, if it comes to Sven Giegold already mentioned, the cocktail effects and persistent substances like PFAS. So these are the important subjects to tackle now, and where we have to work on the weaknesses that we see. So the Green Deal is really an opportunity to accelerate the work that we have been doing over the last years. And I also agree with Commissioner who said that an ambitious regulative framework will really push for innovation and guarantee competitiveness. But it's because it's also about competitiveness. On a dead planet, you do not have a good economic environment. So we really need ambition, but we need to have, as politicians, the right framework to work on and to work with industry in that framework. So what are the tools that Luxembourg sees that we need for sustainable shift? So first, the framework. Secondly, knowledge management, research, innovation. Transparency throughout the whole life cycle of chemicals is key if we want to go to a circular economy. So data needs to be accessible. We need to have better information, and we need to streamline. So use digitalization in order to have full transparency over the whole life cycle in order to make us able to close the loop and to shift to a circular economy. Maybe some examples in order to showcase that we are already working as member states. We are not only helping our industry and our economic sector by having a help desk if it comes to REACH, but we also launched this year the Circular Dataset Initiative together with Economy Ministry, where we work together as 12 countries to develop standards and processes in order to really show the whole life cycle, so throughout the whole product chain. The product circularity data sheet thus enables products to be really circular, and in section 2 of this data sheet, you also have information on chemicals and substances, which is absolutely needed. Because if there are substances of concern, you won't be able to shift to circularity. So for us, this is a really pioneering thing where we see that we will create an internal market, that we will promote innovation. And secondly, maybe one I think every member state now is working on a zero-waste strategy. Luxembourg adopted its first zero-waste strategy this July in order to really show the ambition on a member state level that we want to have this shift. Because if we all agree where we want to go, it will be easier for industry to follow and to be compliant. Promoting not only the whole life cycle concept, but I think you already mentioned it, Sven, promoting a safe and sustainable by design will be crucial because it's the beginning of the creation of a product where we need to really look at it and where we have to switch to, yes, toxic-free cycles. So non-toxic material cycles, which is essential for transition to a circular economy. So new product policy framework should therefore integrate, and I think Jutta mentioned this, all environmental sustainability aspects like energy use, efficiency, circular economy, and the safe and sustainable by design. And here you see where, and this is my last really big point, is that the holistic approach, and I mentioned this in the beginning, is absolutely needed. We need short-term action and long-term strategy. I'm looking forward what Commission will put forward, but the most important is to work together with all, so in my case with the finance ministry, in order to create new opportunity for the finance sector to shift to circularity, to work with economic ministry and health ministry, for instance, in order to put forward how important it is for health of people from the beginning of their life that we shift to circularity, but also show that circular economy is the big opportunity for implementing the Green Deal. So, and then last thing, I think also the agricultural sector plays a crucial role. So really working in a holistic, cross-cutting manner, working together with other countries. Luxembourg is part of a reach-up group, so a group of ambitious member states who really want to push for ambition. So I encourage Commissioner to put forward something ambitious, and I'm sure that we're going to support this and create a new framework which is fit for purpose, fit for a shift for a pollution-free world. And with this, I would like to thank you for listening and thank you once again for this wonderful initiative.
Thank you, Carole. Thank you for this very inspiring examples that Luxembourg is already Luxembourg has already brought on the way. I especially like the horizontal approach of including the economic, the finance sector, so that we really have a holistic view on the whole value chain and do not forget, for example, financing the right things and not pour any more money in destructive technologies. Thank you very much, Carole. And now I would like to turn to Bjorn Hansen, wherever, there he is. Hi, Bjorn. He's the director of the European Chemicals Agency in Helsinki. So it's climate friendly that we do this as a webinar. And I think Bjorn liked very much that not more than one person already called for better funding of the agencies, because of course you can only deliver your task, deliver your work when you have the proper funding and when you can recruit the personnel that you need. Bjorn, we would very much like to hear your view on a new chemicals strategy. The floor is yours.
Thank you very, very much, Jutta. Thank you very much, distinguished speakers before me. And indeed, thank you for the call for funding. Basically, it's not, in my perspective, it's an issue we can do a lot. We'll happily do a lot. And if you want us to do a lot, please fund us appropriately. And thanks for that support. But I'll get to that in the very end. First, ECHA's role. We are, of course, an independent scientific technical agency. So what's our role in EU policy development, which is what we're discussing here? Well, basically, we try to understand what policy wants, extract from what policy wants to see what are the scientific and technical things that need to be done to achieve what policy wants, and then roll up the sleeves, get ready for the time when policy asks us to do something. We're a bit in the middle bit. We're analyzing what we're hearing, and definitely listening to the distinguished speakers before me helps frame what we think in ECHA would be needed in order to achieve the objectives that you have been mapping out here. The most comprehensive package of what is wants to be achieved has been produced by the Commission. So I will refer a lot to the various initiatives of the Commission in trying to explain what it is we think is needed. But clearly, I think a lot of what the Carole, Sven, but also you, Jutta, have been saying beforehand link very nicely to that very same storyline. So if I start basically with the Green Deal, then our view is that the Green Deal as such places a lot of new demands on the chemicals that we want to use today, adding on the demands that are already there. And I will detail this in a little bit. But also we see it the other way around, that if these demands on the chemicals are not met, we will not meet the objectives of the Green Deal set out in the various Commission papers by 2050. So doing it right at the chemical level is a prerequisite. And again, I'll explain a little bit there. We see three demands being pushed or placed on chemicals. One is the demands that result from climate neutrality by 2050. And this is very clearly spelled out in the Commission's industry strategy, that industry, in order to meet climate neutrality by 2050, needs to go through a very deep transition. The industry strategy by the Commission also sets out that chemical industry is one of the highest energy demanding industries in Europe. Looking at those two together, evidently, one can work on the generation of industry to meet of energy, so the supply side of energy to make it greener, but evidently, if also the demand side is reduced, the likelihood that we achieve climate neutrality by 2050 will increase. Since chemical industry has such a big demand, clearly reducing the energy that they consume, either through more efficient production processes or by simply developing chemicals that need less energy to be produced, would support our climate neutrality goal of 2050. So this is a demand on the actual molecules that are put on the market and used, is all the way back to how are they produced and the energy needed for that production, which needs to be incorporated into what chemicals we want on the market in the future. Then comes circularity. Circularity is all about reusing materials. Materials are made up of chemicals. There's no material that's not made up of chemicals. All materials are made up of chemicals. The reusability of a material is determined by the chemistry of the chemicals in that material, and hence by the chemicals. There are hardly any circular materials on the market. We are working hard on increasing more loops in a longer linear model, but truly circular materials, they're very few. So this is a new demand, an additional demand on the actual chemicals that are put on the market, is to ensure not only that recycling can be done at low energy in order to reach climate neutrality, can be produced with lower energy, but also can be recycled, either at the chemical level or at the molecule, at the material level. There's a new demand on the molecules on the market. Then comes the safety, the third leg of demands that we're observing that policy is putting in addition on chemicals, where we see the zero pollution agenda coming with additional demands on those chemicals which inevitably, through their use or manufacture, will be emitted into the environment. We see there additional demands than what currently happens. And then, of course, the long-awaited or eagerly awaited, I think is the right word, so apologies, Commissioner, the chemical strategy. There, in our view at the moment, we're not looking at the chemical strategy because it's not adopted in there, but what we try to look at is identify what the Commission has been saying. And there clearly we see the Commission coming up, and this starts with President Ursula von der Leyen's political agenda, which already emphasizes the need to higher the standards, increase safety for chemicals. So therefore we see these three legs having increased demands on the chemicals we produce. We put that under the umbrella of basically, we need a definition of a sustainable chemical which fulfills all those demands. And there we think that such a definition has, of course, a policy angle, but also has a lot of technical and scientific components. And there we think that working policy technical scientific side can work on defining what we want in the future as a sustainable chemical. Looking at the fact that the chemicals we have today largely do not fulfill whatever definition of a sustainable chemical we will have in the future, this means that the chemicals we have today are not the chemicals that we want tomorrow, largely. Of course, there are some. So we need a lot of innovation. And this is again back to who innovates on the chemicals we use today. It's industry. So industry, chemicals industry is the solution, as is all the players around the table, including an agency like ours. What we therefore need to do is we need to sort through the chemicals we have today in order to make sure that those that we don't want tomorrow are slowly phased out, and those that are acceptable today for a tomorrow may stay. And therefore, implementation of the current legislation, for example, REACH, is of enormous importance. And we need to work hard, and we believe that we have been in ECHA, but we need to work even harder to create efficiencies in our implementation so that we can accelerate our work. Because the faster we are in finishing our main chunk of implementation work at REACH, the quicker we are in creating the knowledge base, which enables us to find the new chemicals which will be sustainable for the future, and to address the problems that are associated with the existing chemicals on the market, plus being able to find those which are actually sustainable already today. Beyond implementation of what we do, for example, in ECHA, we also think that the whole interface with all other legislation can be done much more efficiently. And this is what we understand under the Commission's term of one substance, one assessment. And this basically means better dividing the work between the scientific bodies providing advice to the Commission, consolidation of these bodies, and there where consolidation and dividing the work better does not help, better coordination. And when I say better coordination, I definitely do not mean creating new bodies, new procedures, new decisions that slow down everything. I simply mean the coordination so that we are aware what happens where, so that we in ECHA know what EFSA will be doing next year so that we can plan. EFSA knows what we do in a year, so they can plan. And that the Commission services who tell us what to do, EFSA or ECHA, talk together before they tell us. That's what we mean with better coordination. That's the implementation aside, where we think efficiencies can be gained, transparency can be improved, consistency can be improved, which increases predictability, which is good for innovation, good for the internal market, good for competitiveness, and good for the environment. Looking at the future, in order to get to sustainable chemicals, we need a lot knowledge base, a chemical knowledge base. So we need to collect much more, all information, relevant information on chemicals, and to make it available. Making it available supports the objectives of the digital agenda, which is one of the 2 feet of the industrial agenda in order to promote the digital economy. But also what it would do is it would move competition in finding these new molecules which fulfill our definition of sustainable chemicals to the development of those molecules and not the mere holding of data. And that's true competition within the philosophy of the digital agenda as presented by the Commission recently. And again, fully within the industry agenda also presented a few months ago. So that is more or less a prerequisite, but what we then need to do is clearly drive innovation. And I think also all the previous speakers have talked about that. Innovation has 2 drivers. It has a regulatory drive, which is there to wrap up the laggards, those who are not doing the job the way we want them to do. And then you have the soft drive, which is very much, for example, driven with research money, research cooperation, and various other informal but strong collaborations in order to promote those who are in front of the agenda or not very far behind, at least the political objectives. And again, there, an organization like ours can play a role. All of this, in our observation, only works, but I mean, this is a bit, of course, going back to our roots. European Chemicals Agency is an internal market organization. We are based on the functioning of the internal markets. The way we function is we set a high level of protection for human health and the environment, but it needs to be harmonized, and thereby the internal market functions. So all of this, in my view, means also that we must preserve the functioning of the internal market in order to have a harmonized standard, promoting competitiveness within the market. And this also means better controls within it, but also at the borders, which also a number of the previous speakers have spoken of. Finally, let me get to financing. I'm extremely enthusiastic as a scientist leading a fantastic agency, which I think is the most competent agency on this globe to answer a number of the questions that you put forward. I'm not saying we can answer them, but we can come up with the best answer available. Of course, we need some sort of financing. And what I see is that the ambition level is rightfully, I mean, from a scientific perspective, what I see in these policy documents is rightfully higher ambition. But higher ambition normally comes with a cost. That cost, of course, needs to be paid once we've looked at all efficiencies that the whole system can be gained. For example, one substance, one assessment. But we expect there is an additional cost. And if the member states do not want the union to get the funding to do the work, that this additional ambition is needed, well, then the member states will need to do it. And I think that that is a clear debate that we have in the agency with our member state partners, that this ambition, the work that I've mapped out, it will need to be done. And if it doesn't get done through a union budget, it will need to be done by the member states. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bjorn, for this very comprehensive account of what ECHA thinks should be done in order to actually make the chemical strategy fly at the end of the day. I think especially the point on finance is crucial, because we will need a lot of investment, and we need to really have good rules on that, similar to the rules that have already been adopted by Parliament and Commission on the green taxonomy. So we should extend these to chemical production, and we need, of course, good criteria for that. Thank you, Bjorn, for this input. And now I would like to bring in Sylvie Lemoine from CEFIC. As I said, CEFIC is the European Association of the Chemical Industry, representing more than 500 individual companies. So Sylvie probably has a lot of different perspectives from the members of CEFIC, and I would very much like to bring you in now, and the floor is yours. Thanks for making this possible at such a short notice.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for the invitation indeed. And yes, on some parts we agree, on other parts we disagree, and I will try to outline our views. So I'll start with the broader picture. You've heard it from most speakers, but let me reiterate. Chemicals are indispensable for achieving the Green Deal. 96% of manufactured goods in Europe rely on chemistry. So we are the front center of the Green Deal transition, and we want to be the actors of this transition. And no doubt that there are huge opportunities coming with the Green Deal. CEFIC supports the Green Deal and Europe's ambition to become climate neutral by 2050. We don't know yet how we will get there, but we definitely support the ambition. And the transformation has started. There are breakthrough technologies in the pipeline, such as a project on electric crackers, chemical recycling, and now we're talking of clean hydrogen, which we fully support. And we need much more. And we want this transformation to happen in Europe and for Europe. And since the chemical strategy is part of the Green Deal, it should mirror the Green Deal in bringing together the different dimensions and balancing the different dimensions for a successful transition to a green and digital economy. We need the best brains and the highest performing materials, chemicals, to address the public health and the climate emergencies we're facing right now. And the European Parliament resolution is also calling for coherence of the different policy objectives, and we very much welcome that. And we also agree that safety always comes first. There's no trade-off on safety. Everyone wants a toxic-free environment. And if what is meant with non-toxic is that there should be no harmful level of chemicals around us or in the environment, then we fully agree. So what are the issues that we see with the current approach on the chemical strategy for sustainability? And this is only based on the leaked draft chemical strategy that I think all of us saw back in June. So it probably and hopefully has changed in the meantime. First issue, the strategy appears to propose a root and branch reform of the legislative system. We're saying, and we all agree, with REACH, Europe has world-class chemical legislation. After huge investment of time and resources, both by the regulators at European level, at national level, by industry and many other actors, we're seeing evidence that REACH is working. And the Commission itself, in its reviews of chemical legislation, concluded that REACH is fit for purpose and meets its objective of protecting human health and the environment. And we're still very active implementing REACH, and no doubt that there is room for further improvement, for more enforcement, and we've heard about that, and we would agree. But we should be also more proud of what has been achieved. I'm actually sad to hear so much negativity coming across from some of the speakers. We've done a lot. And the strategy now proposes a fundamental reform of the system as far as we can tell. But changing it all now would actually put a halt on a serious momentum. REACH is not broadly followed by the rest of the world. There's a risk of widening the gap. Look only at the UK. With Brexit, UK is working on implementing REACH 1, REACH as we know it today. If we make now fundamental changes towards REACH plus, REACH 2, whatever we call it, in parallel, we also introduce a gap with our neighbors. And SMEs are struggling. We just received a letter from an Italian SME that imports textile down. They're very active in textile. It's a family business, very successful. They've done their very best to comply with REACH. And they're now facing a REACH restriction, a generic restriction on dyes. And they say two things. They say, we have understood two things in all these years. SMEs count for nothing, and EU industry is not protected against non-EU competing countries, in spite of all the statements that SMEs are the backbone of European economy. And they say literally, we're really worried, and COVID-19 is only the last bit. The biggest threat that they see, it's actually the non-compliant Chinese imports that remain unpunished and enjoy a free ride on the European market. So there is huge potential from further improvement and enforcement, not reset. Now is not the time to reset the system. Second issue, as far as we can tell, and again, based on an early draft, the strategy appears to take a piecemeal approach and is inherently contradictory. We need a strategy that is coherent, and we need to really support the transition in the way we produce chemicals, but also in the chemicals we produce. We agree with that. We need new, high-performing chemicals, durable materials as well. And for the time being, the strategy is underwhelming from that perspective. It looks like a puzzle full of pieces lying on the floor, but we don't see the pieces coming together. We cannot see the picture, and we believe it's imbalanced, and we also spotted some contradictions. And I will mention two. The same document said or was saying that the EU has been undeniably successful in reducing the risks to humans and the environment. The EU chemicals legislation has positioned Europe as front runner in health and environmental protection. And the same document says the current framework has not been sufficient, and we need to redefine the way we design, produce, use, towards a toxic-free environment and establish a toxic-free hierarchy. And then we've been moving from substances of very high concern to substances of concern, and now we're hearing eliminate hazardous substances. But actually, hazardous substances are the ones that are needed. They are reactive. They are needed to make other chemicals. So a blanket elimination of hazardous substances is missing a lot of the nuances, and is actually not the way REACH was designed. REACH is taking, uses, exposure, potential releases into account. And that's something that we were welcoming very much in REACH, and we would hopefully see as remaining. Another contradiction. The document says we want to step up international standards, promote the use of GHS, the globally harmonized system. And at the same time, it proposes to introduce new hazard classes under CLP, which is the European implementation of GHS, for endocrine disruptors, for PBTs and PMTs. What this does is basically departing away from GHS. CLP is moving away from GHS. We're losing the G and the H of GHS, global and harmonized. And this is another inconsistency. The Parliament resolution, for example, on endocrine disruptors, was more balanced in the sense that it says CLP and in parallel GHS to avoid this widening the gaps. So what do we need? We need a strategy that creates the business case to invest in Europe. We need more positivity. We need to grasp the opportunities coming from this transition. We want a digital agenda for Europe. We need chemicals for electronics, and we need the recyclability assessments that go with it. We need massive amounts of offshore wind turbines. That means we need durable and high performance materials that resist the harsh environment in the offshore environment, and that can be recycled at the end of their service life. We need more energy efficient building. Then we need construction chemicals, new construction chemicals to insulate, to protect, to rebuild. So no doubt there are opportunities. And over the years, we've been losing competitiveness to the rest of the world. About nearly half of the chemical sales have moved away from Europe in the last 20 years. So we need to decide if we want the 1.2 million jobs of this industry to remain in Europe, or to be in Europe, and to grow in Europe, or if it's elsewhere and it comes back via imports and sometimes via non-compliant imports. We're talking of reshoring pharmaceuticals. President Macron treated last week, we need to relocate and recreate production forces on our territories. Health and industrial sovereignty will be one of the pillars of the post-corona recovery plan. We agree with that. And as someone said before, chemicals are the raw materials for the pharmaceuticals and for co-formulants. And many of the chemicals needed to produce pharmaceuticals would probably qualify as toxic or hazardous, and they are needed to make those other chemicals. So we need a consistent approach, blanket elimination of hazardous chemicals without looking into the uses and how they are and whether there is release and whether there is exposure is not going to be the solution. The strategy needs to give equal weight to all factors. We actually welcome the move to sustainable by design, safe and sustainable by design. Safe is a prerequisite, but sustainable by design, from our perspective, means bringing together the different factors. So when we look at a new product or we do product assessment, we look at energy use, we look at water and land use, we look at resource efficiencies, but also at durability and recyclability. And there may be trade-offs to be made. But we need standard methodologies and criteria for that. Otherwise, it's going to be my sustainability versus your sustainability, because maybe I believe water use is more important than energy use, for example, or vice versa. We need a strong and coordinated enforcement policy. Not only enforcement, but also enforceability. Someone was also saying we need to be able to test the products on the shelf. For that, we need the methods to measure whether the products that we find on the internet or on the shelves are compliant. We need to do a better job at checking whether the measures that are put forward are enforceable, because that's a prerequisite to better enforcement. With 92% of the non-compliances we've reached in the area of consumer products come from non-European countries. This is the RAPEX database under the General Product Safety Directive. 92% come from non-EU countries. We're happy to see the European Parliament resolution is calling for new ways of looking at enforcement. And I believe at least the early draft of the strategy was talking of zero tolerance on enforcement. We would welcome more specific measures on the part of the Commission on how this is going to be achieved. And obviously, member states have a role to play as well. We need to build on the solid foundations of our regulatory system. We need to improve them. We need to solve legacy issues and find proportionate solutions, for example, to endocrine disruptors, mixtures, combined effects, and we need to find solutions for a better assessment of persistent chemicals. No one wants persistent chemicals in the environment, and no one wants endocrine disruptors in the toys of our kids. We need a structured, multi-stakeholder dialogue. Several speakers said it before, we welcome that. Again, based on the draft we saw before, there was some discussion about a dialogue or alliance only on some parts of the strategy. Why not a dialogue on the entire strategy? We cannot transform this industry without a dialogue, but also without listening to the needs of society, of customers, of the different value chains. We need more information, we've heard that. Innovation is more than substitution of certain chemicals, it's a real mindset change, and from that perspective, sustainable by design is important, and we agree with that. We need regulatory predictability because it's a key component, a critical component of the business case. One substance, one assessment is a move in the right direction, but we believe that some people have been talking of regulatory management options analysis. There may be some misunderstanding on what it means. We don't agree that it's paralysis by analysis. We see with 40 plus pieces of legislation, it should be clear to everyone when you identify a concern with a certain chemical, which piece of legislation is going to address which concern in which order, who does what when. And that should be clear. There's a concern, so do you start with CLP or REACH? And then maybe there's a food contact application, so it may have to go to EFSA. Maybe there's a cosmetic regulation and there has to be a separate assessment for cosmetics. And maybe there's workers' exposure and there is a need for occupational health and safety legislation to take some measures. But what we see today is that this all comes at different times and it's unpredictable. And some member states run their own assessment, which contradicts some other assessments. So we should have a clear stepwise process. This is not necessarily analysis of all the details, but it's clarity of who does what when, and that would contribute a lot to predictability and also helping SMEs to find their way in the maze of the legislative system. And last but not least, we need an integrated impact assessment in line with better regulation, integrated in meaning of the entire chemical strategy. So to conclude, yes, safety comes first. No one wants harmful chemicals around us, but hazardous does not mean harmful. And what we need above all at this point in time is a balanced strategy and consistency between the different policy objectives. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Sylvie. This was very, very comprehensive, and you took a view on the whole draft strategy, at least at the leak, which was brought out by a newspaper some time ago. But I believe that we are. It is good to have this conversation and to have this debate between different actors, because as many have already said, we need a dialogue between all stakeholders and we need the holistic view. And you have very rightfully said 92% of illegal substances or products in breach of REACH legislation come from non-EU countries. So it's both in the interest of consumers and of industry to actually enforce the existing legislation, all the more because we all know that environmental pollution is not properly priced yet. So the societal cost will be covered by ourselves, by our children, by our grandchildren and great-grandchildren, who will have to live with the health effects of the pollution taking place today. So it should be in all of our interest to prevent this. I believe this is our duty also as a generation. So thank you very much that CEFIC has taken up so many of the demands on safety and sustainability in chemistry. Now, last but surely not least, I come to Frida Höck. Frida is from ChemSec, a co-chair of ChemSec, and ChemSec has worked a lot in the field of sustainable chemicals, consumer protection, and I would very much like to hear your view on the Green Action Plan and also on what the other panelists may have said already. It's a bit difficult, and I can promise to everyone we already have several pages of questions. It will not become boring after Frida has spoken. Frida, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jutta and Sven, for this invitation. And thanks also to all the previous speakers who said a lot of inspiring things, a few concerning things, but mostly inspiring. So the election of the European Parliament last spring gave us headlines like the Green Wave over Europe. And early this year, the Green Deal was adopted by the European Commission, including the Zero Pollution Strategy. This clearly shows Europe is moving towards a sustainable future. And solving the climate crisis is one part of moving towards sustainability, of course. Substituting hazardous chemical of concern, as well as moving towards a toxic-free circular economy, are the very important parts. This means we need to find solution to the climate crisis without the use of chemicals of concern, as well as create a circular economy without recycling toxic chemicals. And all these challenges needs to be dealt with simultaneously. This is challenging, but necessary, and I definitely believe it's possible. And we need the chemical industry to be part of this transition as a solution provider. And to facilitate for the chemical industry, in our view, to be able to focus its innovation resources in the right direction, it needs clear direction from policymakers, as well as support when moving ahead. So my two main points today will be regulation drives innovation and the need to focus on support of the European frontrunners. At ChemSec, the environmental organization I represent, we focus a lot on dialogues with companies, both with international brands, using a lot of chemicals in their production, as well as part of the chemical industry. We also follow the regulatory processes in the EU connected to chemicals very closely. And today I would like to share my perspective, or our perspective, what's needed to move Europe towards sustainability. So I will start to dig into my first point, regulation drives innovation. ECHA released a new report this summer with the conclusions that regulation drives companies to substitute hazardous chemicals for safer alternatives. This does not come as a surprise to most, and also the anticipation of regulation has been shown to drive innovation. Parts of industry will argue that regulation hinders innovation. I would rather put it that regulation helps industry prioritize its innovation efforts in the right direction, towards sustainability and the phase out of hazardous substances in this case. I don't say it's easily done. It requires a lot of work and resources, so no surprise parts of industry are not thrilled about being given this challenge. And some may argue we have an ambitious regulations in the EU. That's true, but numerous studies in recent years has also shown, and as has been said by previous speakers, that we need to step up our efforts to phase out chemicals of concern. For example, the refit evaluation process from a few years back concluded in short that the framework we have is good, it's a good start, but not enough to protect European citizens from hazardous chemicals. And also said by many of the previous speakers, additional to a more ambitious regulation on chemicals within the EU, the implementation of the regulation in place is also key. I mean, we all know the devil is in the details. And our experience is that if industry is given clear limits and frame, they are able to adapt to a strict regulation. But if regulators are weak in implementation and not staying firm in their messages, the same industry will start to stretch the boundaries, and it becomes unclear for everyone where the boundaries are, and the ambitious regulation is gradually undermined. And also enforcement, the same with enforcement here. It's key to have efficient enforcement to make sure an ambitious regulation is not undermined. So to protect EU citizens from hazardous chemicals, we therefore need to regulate the production and use of hazardous chemicals more effectively, as well as to be more firm in implementation and strict in enforcement. We also need to speed up the regulatory processes, and I will use the same abbreviation as Sven used. We need to move from the paralysis by analysis. And what do we mean by that? Well, many chemicals of concern are sort of in the system or on our radar, but instead of regulating them based on available data, industry and regulators are asking or requesting more and more information. And that leaves us in a situation where EU is restricting hazardous chemicals at an extremely slow pace, even if it's clear that we're not protecting EU citizens from harmful chemicals efficiently. And that is the so-called paralysis by analysis situation. And today we have heard a lot of ambitious words, and I'm really looking forward to the action here. We need action. So nice words are a very good start, but action is definitely needed. So additional to this, many international well-known brands, users of chemicals, are asking for strict regulation as well. I will give you one example. The PFAS group, also mentioned earlier, the group of persistent chemical linked to a number of health issues, very infamous due to a number of lawsuits in the US linked to production and use of this group. At ChemSec, we have gathered companies who like to see an EU-wide restriction on the PFAS group in the so-called ChemSec PFAS movement. Today, we have 19 companies who have signed on to this movement. For example, Kingfisher, H&M, and all signatories are asking regulators to regulate the chemical group PFAS. It might sound strange, companies asking for regulation, but these companies have committed to end their use of PFAS. Many of them are struggling to find suitable alternatives, and a regulation or even anticipation of regulation of PFAS spur innovation towards alternatives. And regulation would also make communication in these companies' supply chain much easier. So clearly in this case, regulation drives innovation. Coming to my second point for today, the need to focus on supporting European frontrunners. The transition towards sustainability is also reflected in the business world, of course. At ChemSec, we are in contact with a number of companies, mainly companies using chemicals in their production, and we see that many brands are very ambitious when it comes to sustainability and progressive chemicals management. Many go beyond regulation, have ambitious RSL list, restricted substance list, with substances they do not allow into their products. And why do they? Well, they see hazardous chemicals as a commercial risk. They want to be progressive. They want a good reputation among consumers, but also among potential employees. But they also want to follow their time, take responsibility. They don't want to be seen as good, but also do good for society. They are part of the green wave. And these companies are, of course, dependent on the chemical producers to innovate and provide alternatives to the harmful substances the companies plan to restrict in their products. And this is an enormous potential for the chemical industry to provide safer alternatives to the growing number of brands aiming to phase out chemicals of concern. To support the transition towards more sustainable alternatives, the EU needs to support the innovative companies, the frontrunners, and the future-proof industry. Supporting them will facilitate for them to develop hazard-free, sustainable solutions. But this also means that all companies should not be saved at every cost. Although there will be a majority of winners, there will also be losers. And decision makers in the EU must accept that not all companies will survive the necessary changes, but need to assure that the frontrunners do. So we need to ask ourselves, what industry do we want in the future? The innovative frontrunners or the slow movers? Our experience from following EU regulation for many years is that if policymakers focus on each company and their economic interest, there is a tendency to support the slow ones, the slow movers, instead of the future companies. I have one example here as well. Within the authorization process in REACH, ChemSec has had a number of discussions with very frustrated companies producing alternatives to substances of very high concern, but not being able to expand their market share, since the hazardous substances have been given green light for continued use, a so-called authorization. Which means the incentive to shift to the alternative is much less than if the hazardous substance had not been given the same green light. I've even heard alternative providers saying they consider moving to China to expand their business. This would be very unfortunate. We need to make sure that alternative providers stay and flourish in the EU. We need to focus on the frontrunners. Additional to policymaker, companies and consumers now mentioned, moving towards sustainability, also investors show an increasing interest in how chemicals of concern may affect the valuation of companies, or rather an interest in how to not invest in hazardous chemicals. In June, ChemSec launched a ranking of the 35th largest stock exchange listed chemical producers worldwide. The ranking was made towards sustainability criteria. What we found was that many of the top performers are based in the EU. We also learned from having discussions with a majority of these companies. They all like to work actively to improve their score. They all like to be ranked more sustainable. Future profits are found in safer alternatives. So to conclude, the Green Deal sets out the frames to develop the chemical strategy. It clearly says the protection of EU citizens should be improved and encourage innovation for the development of safe and sustainable alternatives. The European Parliament gave its opinion on this strategy in the resolution adopted this summer. And we hope that the Commission takes on this message, strengthen it further, and adopt an ambitious chemical strategy. It's the most efficient way to direct the chemical industry innovation efforts in the right direction towards sustainability. The EU also needs to support the frontrunners, so companies producing sustainable alternatives without hazardous chemicals, the future-proof companies instead of the slow movers, to support the transition towards sustainability. And for part of the audience working within the chemical industry, I have a message for you. You have a great opportunity to gain in the race towards sustainability if you focus on innovation and producing alternatives to chemicals of concern. The demand is on the rise. Take this opportunity and follow the rest of Europe in this green wave. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Frida. And again, I'm thinking of, oh, had this only been a physical event, because I think a lot of the speakers would have received a considerable amount of applause, which cannot be given in an online webinar. I'm very sorry for that. And now we have 1 hour left. And in this hour, I will try to look at all the different questions that we have already received, and also try to choose questions from every angle. There have been quite a few angles which have been addressed by the people who gave questions here. I might as well start with one issue that has been addressed by several participants, which I will sort of try to comprehend into one single question. And this is concerning animal welfare. Stefan asked, how will the EU try to foster toxicity tests without animals according to the OECD guidelines? How is the EU planning to make their guidelines stronger and more enforce them more? And how will be made sure that, this is from another participant, but I don't find the question right now. Well, how will be made sure that all aspects of health and toxicity tests are properly covered in toxicity testing? Will there be possibilities, for example, lab on a chip, organs on a chip, that go beyond the old animal tests? So I believe the question should maybe go to Bjorn. I'm not really sure who feels comfortable with this difficult issue. So please, Bjorn, what do you think?
Thank you very much also for the question. From my perspective, I think it is evident that if we can avoid animal testing, it has a multiplicity of benefits. Animal testing takes a long time, costs a lot of money. And basically, if we can get the same information with less money, much quicker, we effectively move towards being able to meet the Green Deal 2050 objective quicker, more comprehensively, which is good for environment and health. It's good for innovation because we can better and quicker innovate. So basically good for everybody. That's not the issue. The issue is, can we do it today? And there my answer is no. Then comes the question, what needs to be done to enable us to be there? Well, simply inherent in prediction, which is what we need in order to move away from animal models, is more knowledge. So it's all about how do we generate enough knowledge to be able to substitute the information we get, which is necessary to ensure safety, without an animal model. And I'll illustrate and then I'll stop. Generically, reproductive toxicity, when we do an animal study, we look into something like 200 things that can go wrong in an animal. In order to be able to predict, rather than look at the animal, we therefore need to understand what happens biologically, and very often down to the cellular level, in these 200 occasions. And we are very, very far away from being able to do that. So my view is a lot of the work we're doing today in terms of testing, but also accepting derogation statements, non-animal testing in a regulatory context, creates the knowledge base, which at some point in the future will enable us to reduce and at some point, hopefully eliminate animal testing. If you really want to accelerate this, it's not me that needs to be looked at. It needs a consolidated research agenda over decades, which basically simulates the Human Genome Project, which is all about understanding what does any molecule do when it enters a biological organism. And I think anybody who studies medicine or knows something about medicine knows that we are very far away from doing that today. Thank you.
Thank you, Bjorn. And actually, the situation at the moment is quite strange. I remember when I was I don't know, I have worked in a laboratory which did studies for GLP purposes as head of quality assurance, and we did not do testing on vertebrates, but we tested, for example, for eye irritation, skin irritation with human skin that had been in little tissue pots, and you could use this human skin instead of killing rabbits. And I thought this was a great progress. And then I found out that the design of this test had to be adapted so that it would show the effects on human skin not as well as it could have, but in order to make it comparable to the old animal testing. And this should be, in my view, there should be introduced a factor for the old animal test, but we should use the proper answer from the human skin test. And there are quite a few examples like that. But I do believe that a lot of scientists are working on the replacement of animals because of the growing public conscience on animal testing. I do have a very much related question, which goes to Virginijus Sinkevičius. By we have said, I think we have said that we don't say the last names of people, so it's by Professor Dr. Joseph. And he writes, the burden of evidence for a chemical to be classified as hazardous is currently unrealistically high and often depends on academic research. Is the Commission planning changes to the classification criteria? And if yes, would it also consider better policies and regulation that would provide incentives for the industry to do more in ensuring that chemicals on the European market do not affect animal or human health and or environment? And what is the position of the Commission on suspected or presumed endocrine disrupting chemicals? Some of these questions you have a little bit addressed in your speech, Virginijus, but the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your question, and probably I would like to thank you for a very well balanced discussion here. I was really pleased to hear different angles and different positions, and I think, as I said, it's going to be a hot topic in town for this autumn, and it's great that we kick off with these discussions early on. Now, returning back to the question regarding the first part of the question, if the Commission is planning changes to the classification criteria, we are not. We're not questioning the system we are currently having, but we are rather looking if additional criteria are needed. And here comes, reply to a second part of the question on policies and regulation to provide incentives. And we are indeed reflecting how we can provide incentives, and not only, but also to the chemicals industry to ensure that we design, develop, produce, and use chemicals in a way that truly maximizes their contribution to society while avoiding harm to the planet and to current and future generations. And for this, we are looking at a number of different measures. And of course, we certainly welcome the involvement of all relevant stakeholders in this process. Yeah. Okay, I can hear that there was another question on endocrine disruptors.
Yes.
Jutta, I can't hear you. Yes, now I can hear you. Yeah, let me then address the
on suspected or presumed endocrine disrupting chemicals. That was the second question.
Correct. Okay. Here, I think first of all must be a coherent approach to the identification of endocrine disruptors across all relevant EU's legislation based on the broadly accepted definition of the WHO. And the recently established criteria for pesticides and biocides is a truly a first step in this direction, as they are in line with the WHO definition. EU legislation in other fields does not contain such criteria, but the WHO definition is already being applied in other legislation, for example, in REACH. And we are working on a proposal to include endocrine disruptors in the classification, labeling, and packaging regulation. This will allow to find a solution for the identification of endocrine disruptors with a horizontal approach at the European level. And discussions on these proposals are still ongoing. Regarding, different subcategories suspected or presumed, it will need to be considered as part of this discussion. We will, however, need to ensure that the criteria we develop are fit for purpose for all relevant legislation in order to achieve a horizontal approach, and this will provide the same predictability and legal certainty as for other hazard classes. So the fitness check on endocrine disruptors should give us a full picture and inform us if there is a need to amend the different legal frameworks. And we plan to adopt this fitness check together with the chemical strategy for sustainability, which means, I would say, probably around middle of autumn.
Okay, thank you very much, Bjorn. And we have Bjorn. Sorry, I'm just speaking what I'm reading instead of addressing people. I have a question which is addressed to Sylvie by Anna, saying chemicals industry has always claimed that hazardous chemicals are used only at safe levels, but obviously harm has been done in spite of these risk assessments. What will be different now?
We're generating more and more data, and that's one of the added values of REACH. We have the largest, database of chemical safety data in the world, and definitely we need to learn from that. It's part of learning, it's part of the improvement, it's part of the added value that REACH has brought over previous legislation. It's not perfect, probably, and yes, there's still some work to do in terms of having a full understanding of where the chemicals go and whether there is potential for release. One example, we're still discussing supply chain communication and having a full understanding of all uses under REACH. This is actually already foreseen under REACH, but we are struggling because the supply chains are very complex. So what we need, that's where there's a potential for more digitalization as well, to speed up this information exchange. And then in turn, as the suppliers, as the upstream suppliers, we can take this information into account, run the assessment, and where we see there's a risk, of course, we should take measures. We should prevent, we should control, we should find the best approach. So the world is not perfect. Things are evolving. We're generating more knowledge. What we need is, we agree that we need to take quick action. And yes, by having more data, we truly believe that data can help. I also think that with all this data, and I'm actually bridging to one point discussed before on predicting the properties, animal testing, and so on. Can we look into taking all these data that REACH and other systems have helped generate and try to better predict earlier at the lab stage the properties of a chemical? No one in industry wants to launch a new chemical that may be found later as having a problem or posing a problem. We don't want to leave problems to future generations. We want to do the right things. And part of it is really, but it takes years to do the full testing, truly years. And and we need to find this balance so that we also don't lose in competitiveness. So if we could have one system at the lab stage, which really helps us quickly to predict or to get an alert of where there may be an issue in the future, then we would very much welcome that. Persistency, for example. I mean, today we do a lab test in a lab and we say this substance is biodegradable or not. So the answer is yes or not. You're either biodegradable or you may be forever in the environment. We need a better assessment of whether, if there is release in the environment, what happens? What is the fate? Is it 2 months? Is it 2 years? No one wants, of course, future generations to be exposed to growing amounts of chemicals in the environment. We need to bring this time dimension into our assessment so that we better predict. So from that perspective, that's an element of prevention where we see that we can probably do better over time.
Thank you, Sylvie. Although I do have to, well, save the what chemical laboratories can find out or not. I mean, there are tests for ready biodegradability, that's true, but there are also tests for inherent biodegradability, biodegradability in soil, in seawater, in sediments, and we've done all those. So it's not very simply biodegradable or not, but there are much more sophisticated methods in order to find out what's the environmental fate, and they're already being used. So in order to prevent that any of the participants think, well, they're only doing a one-off thing and don't look at whatever happens later, that's not really the case in most for most substances. I would like to have two other questions and say something myself to those. And this concerns renewable energy and climate goals. Attila asks, do all methods of renewable energy, wind power, biomass, also new technologies like PTX, fuel cell, meet the criteria of green chemistry? And Menina asks, thank you for all your contributions. Question, how far are we with two fields very important for achieving climate goals, namely recycling of solar panels and batteries of electric vehicles? Well, to Attila, I don't think that all methods of renewable energy meet the criteria of green chemistry. We know that especially energy from biomass has not really met the sustainability efforts that everyone thought it would meet at the beginning when we started with energy of which was created from biomass. Everyone thought of animal manure, for example, or of waste which could be degraded in bioplants, but now we have ended up with food crops being grown and then used to produce biogas, or even forests being cut down in order to feed biomass plants. That's not sustainable. Everyone knows that. And of course, we need much stronger sustainability criteria for biomass. We also need to improve the way we use wind power. For example, just 2 or 3 days ago, I read that a Norwegian study has found out that if you paint one of the blades of the turbines black, then much less birds will be killed by this turbine. And this would be a very, very simple measure to radically improve nature protection, because at the end of the day, we will not be able to become climate neutral without wind power. But of course, we have to make sure that we don't have this trade-off between biodiversity and renewable energy. It's totally clear that we cannot save biodiversity when we have runaway climate change. So of course, we need to have a coexistence, and we need to do our best to make wind power, solar power, every renewable energy sustainable. And as to the recycling question, there already is the possibility to recycle solar panels. I have known this myth a lot of times, that it's impossible to recycle solar panels and they are all highly poisonous, and none of which is true actually. But you do have a point when it comes to the batteries of electric vehicles. We would very much like to have them all 100% recycled. The main problem indeed is not that you cannot recycle them, but that it is not economically viable, because it's much cheaper to buy the lithium that you need for these large batteries on the global market for raw materials than to retrieve it from the battery. So therefore we do need regulation in this case, because we have a very obvious market failure on this point. Okay, I'm trying to get a bit, yes, maybe we should have this question from Carla, who wants to know what is behind one substance, one assessment. Why would this be more expensive? Did I get Bjorn Hansen correct here? So maybe Bjorn, you could just add a few sentences on this. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Jutta. When I observe the discussion on what does that term mean, then I see many models developing. And some of those models, in my view, seem to at least overcomplicate what we see as good solutions for what the problems are. So if that was what was understood. Basically, what we see is that there can be a consolidation of the groups of experts which give advice to the Commission. There's a multiplicity of such groups, and one could reflect on consolidating. That could help efficiencies and consistency. Another thing that could help is that it's not always clear which committee should look at what. And sometimes we end up looking at the same things, and sometimes we end up not looking at what people are interested in. And therefore, a clearer division as to who does what would also help. So consolidation, clearly, you're responsible for this, and you're responsible for that. And if all of that doesn't work, then simply, I forget, I think it was Frida, but I'm not exactly sure who, it was Sylvie, mentioned, simply if we would know which one of the current multiplicity of scientific bodies reporting to the Commission would be looking at a phthalate, when we are planning or have been told to the Commission in 6 months to look at a phthalate, then that would be an improvement. Those are the three things that we're looking at as being solving the majority of the complications that we encounter. That's what we call one substance, one assessment. But there are a multiplicity of definitions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Bjorn. I think I would now like to have someone really participating in person, so to speak. And I would like to give the floor to Dennis, who is from, now I can read the name too, Dennis Palke, who is from the German Association of the Chemical Industry, I believe. And Dennis, the floor is yours. Yes, this should work now because I gave you the possibility to speak. You have to deactivate your muting, I think.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, very well.
So please, can you repeat the question?
I thought that you wanted to have a question because I saw your hand.
So, sorry, that was not my intention, sorry.
Oh, okay. Then I'll mute you again. Okay. But I do have a hand from Helena. Helena, can you hear me?
I think we can stop.
Maybe she has left the webinar. I don't know. Helena Nimela, I try to give you the floor. Okay, then I'll give the floor to Carla. Maybe she has been able to unmute herself.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. I just have to switch off the translation because it's a little bit irritating. I will try in English. My question would be, we know that there are some problems that chemicals are exported who are not allowed in Europe anymore. They are exported, for example, to Brazil, and then they come back by food. And how we could prevent that critics like Mercosur make European legislation aushebeln. I don't know the English word. So that Mercosur would all the decisions we make
undermine
undermine
I'd say.
the legislation we do right now in Europe, when we have treaties which give possibilities to big enterprises to undermine it. What do you think about it? Thanks.
I think this should be a question maybe to Virginijus, whom I can't see right now.
My video doesn't start for some reason. Yes, I'm here.
You're here. Great.
Yes, so thank you very much for the question. I think in general, we should look at the trade agreements as our possibility as basically bridge to not only export or import goods, but actually export standards. And you heard from what industry said during this panel discussion that we can't forget that we have really, and we are proud of it, we have, chemical legislation which is most advanced in the world. Yes, we see shortages, we see gaps which we should fill and ensure a proper protection of the environment and our citizens. But on the other hand, we have to be careful of not, increasing that gap between the European Union and the rest of the world. And this is why one of the tools which can be extremely helpful in exporting those standards to other countries outside the EU is actually our trade agreements.
Okay, I was just fighting with my microphone, which is sometimes not working the same way as I am. I would like to put a question towards Carole, because Carole, you have already done a front runner in Luxembourg with your own strategy, and I have the question from Kerstin saying, is grouping of chemicals part of the plan to speed up the Green Deal to avoid regrettable substitution? Innovation is no value if you have a similar substance with similar hazardous profile. What is the approach of Luxembourg here?
So first of all, I think our approach by having our zero waste strategy, but also putting forward, was really working for full transparency and really working for alternatives, I may say, not grouping or so our first approach, because we made a big citizen workshops over 1 year, was really not only focusing on chemicals and hazardous components, because we had already some decision taken if it comes to not only chemicals but pesticide, maybe to phase out glyphosate and all those kind of things. But we said let's go and have workshops in order to have all people on board. Because one of my experiences during the last years is, if it comes to chemicals, we had difficulties in bridging those who know a lot about chemicals, those from industry, and those coming from civil society. So what we try to do is really put forward something, so the domain of the chemicals, into the discussion with civil society in order to see what do people want and what do people expect from industry, because all people want to have the works, all people want to keep industries in Europe, but also people expect us to be, and they expect us to be efficient, but they also want to be well protected. So basically what we did during the discussion is try to build bridges, not only to speak amongst experts, but really in the zero waste strategy is really to have this paradigm shift, to say, okay, let's be safe and sustainable by design. Let's avoid as much as we can. Let's work as much as we can on alternative and try to give some responses. So basically, maybe it's not answering immediately your question, but one of the problems I met as an environmental minister is that we had to work with all other ministries, and we had to build a bridge and give as lot as we could as information to our civil society. That's why we not only made a strategy, that's why we decided to make a strategy, implement the directives on circular economy, trying to be front runners by, first of all, helping, but also by transparency. And I mentioned during my speech also the circular data sheet, where we think that we should create an internal European market. So basically, we try to have pragmatic approach based on what citizens want us to promote. Maybe it's not answering immediately your questions, but I wanted to explain once more what we try to do as member states. Small member states do not have their own big agencies, so we rely a lot on working together in a European scale, together with ECHA, to give us the right information. So we rely also a lot on being efficient at a European scale, basically.
Okay, thank you very much for elaborating a bit more on your ambitious plans, and I think this is very inspiring, and we should have many countries all over Europe following your example. I would like to give the floor to Yifaat now, who has posed a very interesting question, and Yifaat, I have just added you, so basically you have to unmute yourself, and I would like to give you the floor. Yifaat Baron, can you hear me?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Okay, I was not completely sure how I unmute. I work at the ECHA Institute, and we do a lot of work basically in relation to substance evaluation and evaluation basically of various exemptions for substances under sectoral legislation. And all of the speakers today basically have been talking about chemicals in general, and mainly in the context of REACH or sometimes CLP. But I'm wondering, what are the plans in terms of the chemical strategy for sectoral legislation of chemicals? For example, the various directives under waste legislation that regulate chemicals, for example, the Toys Directive, for chemical legislation under eco-label, and other areas where are, let's say, more specific, product specific or sector specific.
Okay, thank you, Yifaat. I just got a message from Virginijus Sinkevičius that he has to leave now, because that would be a great question for him, actually. But I think Bjorn has already said that with this hierarchy of the different legislations that have to be changed or adopted when we have a new hazard assessment for a substance, this already gives a bit of a notion. I still see the panel of Commissioner Sinkevičius. So Virginijus, if you're still with us, I would very much like if you could give us 2 or 3 sentences on this. No, probably has left. That's a pity. Well, I'll do something unexpected. I'll ask Frida what she thinks about this question.
Well, thanks for that. I mean, I think that we need all kinds of regulations. So we need to have also product-specific regulation in the EU. And I think, well, I can't really reply to what's happening specifically, but definitely it's needed. And we also know that many of the regulations we have needs to be updated. And also according to what we hope to see in the chemical strategy, then the level of ambition also need to be reflected in more product-specific regulations.
And as a whoops. Yes, as a follow-up question, what do you think of the idea of mandatory labeling of products like we know from food and cosmetics, where you have these very long lists on all the different substances content which are in this product, but we don't have these lists when it comes, for example, to textiles, to electronics, to everyday materials like, I mean, this is fairly easy, a glass, but when you have a cup, it's maybe already different. What do you think of a mandatory labeling? I would like to give this question to the whole panel, actually, because I think it's very interesting, by the way. May you start, Frida, because you're already in run.
Yes, great. Thanks for, I like that question more, actually. I mean, I think that we need to move towards more transparency of what chemicals or products contain. If that being a label on the actual glass or cup, I'm not sure. But to know what it contains, because we need to facilitate for a toxic-free circular economy to be able to have efficient recycling of the products when they come into the waste phase. We need to know what products can be recycled and do not contain hazardous chemicals of concern, or what products do contain substances of very high concern and should not be recycled into something, you know, consumer-wise. So I think, and we also see the companies that we are in contact with, they require more and more information from their suppliers. And the trend is clearly that they don't accept trade secrets when it comes to hazardous chemicals. So I think we will see a shift in this area very soon, because we need to go along that road towards transparency and traceability.
Thank you, Frida. And I'll pass the question on to Sylvie.
Okay, thank you. Yes, we see, we hear, and we take very seriously the call for more transparency. Specifically on labeling, of course, we already have the CLP regulation, which requires labeling of substances and mixtures. There's information being passed via safety data sheets in the B2B, in the industry to industry communication. I think the needs are more for consumer products. I personally don't think that a full list of chemical names on a label, which is very difficult to read in most cases, because we're also going towards smaller packaging, is going to be much helpful. In a sense, too much information kills information, but somehow the information has to be available. And that's where the digital technologies, the digital agenda can help. If we find a way to, for example, blockchain, or I'm not an expert, but let's say blockchain, if we find a way to actually encrypt and decrypt the information about the composition of products in a way that, that fulfills the needs of the recipients. The recyclers need different information from consumers. Consumers need different information from the occupational workers, because you have different protection goals or different needs, as simple as that. So we need to find a way to adapt who needs what and to provide that information. We cannot hide behind trade secret, but the reality, I mean, this is industry, there is competition, and you don't want to give all your composition details to your Chinese competitor either. So we need to find this balance. Again, digital technologies, there's a huge potential. And there's something in the European Parliament resolution that I think is important, and that would be nice to see in the final strategy. We need to provide clear and understandable information to citizens about chemical substances, to citizens, workers, and businesses. And clear and understandable information is important. And I don't think it's a labeling with long list of chemical names that really help reassure or fulfill these needs. But transparency, yes, we really look forward to piloting and testing new digital technologies to achieve what is needed.
Yes, thank you very much. And I do agree that the needs of a recycler are very much different from the needs of the citizen who just wants to use the cup, for example, or the Tupperware or whatever. I would like to bring in one more participant, which is, I believe he's the professor for sustainable chemistry, and I would like to give the floor to Peter Fandke.
Thank you, Jutta. This is Peter. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thanks a lot for giving me the floor. I have, for reference, pasted my 3 comments on the chat also. I believe that some of you know me already, like Bjorn and others. I have 3 points to make. I appreciate the diverse input from the speakers, but I think what we're missing a little bit is how to move forward successfully. I hear a little bit of defense on one side versus the other, and I think that is not really helpful. What we really need is how to come together and define things that we can jointly move forward to be successful in the end. And the first point of the 3 is I propose that we really provide funding to develop positive lists. We are having over decades now more and more negative lists of harmful chemicals and high exposure chemicals and persistent chemicals, which is all true, but it does not really help to move forward to what should we actually develop further? Where should we really seek more progress and put in innovation and investment in the future in terms of what chemicals to develop for what applications? So there are incentives in the scientific community. I'm part of that, but it's not only me, where we try to really develop positive lists, criteria for what is actually safe, what is not just more sustainable, but sustainable enough. I come to that in a second. So to really drive into the right directions. I really encourage that. The second of my 3 comments is that we need to really move away from a hazard-based substitution. We really need to encourage to include quantitatively exposures of workers, consumers, environmentally mediated exposures of humans and ecosystems, but also chemical supply chain impacts and product application lifecycle impacts. There are streamlined ways, especially with the digitalization efforts recently in place, that we can do that. We do not need to look just at the molecule. We can actually look at the trade-offs between a chemical and what some speakers, and I disagree with the term, call non-chemical substitutes. But we can compare specific xenobiotic chemical impacts versus other solutions like technological solutions, behavioral changes and whatnot, if we look at the wider supply chain impacts and the life cycle of everything. If we look at that, we will easily see that some trade-offs are not worth pursuing. So we might minimize a bit more toxicity-related impacts, but we might increase a lot energy use and related greenhouse gas emissions. That we can consider today. It's not done because these things are not used for substitution, but they are in place. And my last comment is we need to define, I heard the term several times today, safe and sustainable. I love that term, but who knows? And I can see Sylvie already smiling on that. Who knows what sustainable really means? I think we have not yet the means to really speak of something that is sustainable. We can be more sustainable than yesterday and more sustainable chemicals than last year. But what is sustainable enough? That is what we really need to go to be in line with a Green Deal target like non-toxic environment, with UN Sustainable Development Goals like reduce emissions by 2030 by 30% and whatnot we have. We need clear science-based targets based on actual carrying capacities of ecosystems. How can they handle and dilute chemical pollution to an extent that is really considered sustainable enough? And that is also on the verge in the science community that many people are working on that worldwide on that based on terms like planetary boundaries, safe operating space. For chemistry, it's much more complex because it's rather local and regional and not global. Really few chemicals are global threats, but most are really impacting the local environment more. We need these things in place, and we should work on that in the near future to move it forward to a successful chemical transition in Europe. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. I do have to say that maybe most chemicals are a local problem only. I mean, for those people living there, that's a very poor comfort to say, oh, okay, we're the only ones with that problem. But we do know how many chemicals are found in the Arctic, in the Antarctic, where they have never ever been used, but they have been transported there, and as they are so persistent, they will stay there for centuries to come. I have another question to Bjorn, actually, saying, for many substances, especially the low tonnage chemicals, information on the hazardous properties is missing. Does the panel foresee that information requirements in REACH will be increased? To explain, we have the so-called low-volume chemicals where that are exempted from the REACH regulation, because else we would have so many chemicals to test that the legislator decided to prioritize the high volume and the very problematic chemicals. But if you have a chemical that is produced in, let's say, 12 kilograms per year, you don't have to do any testing at all.
Yes, thank you, Jutta. I mean, whether the Commission wants to make a proposal for Council and Parliament to change this, that's up to them. From our perspective, it's clear that if you want to do at least a proper screening level risk assessment defined as such by the OECD, then you need more data than is available in the current 1 to 10 ton information requirements. So that's clear. But like you said, Jutta, I mean, the whole tonnage band structure in REACH is used as a surrogate for exposure. And when policy was deciding benefits versus costs, they ended up where REACH right now is, based on that observation that at lower volumes, likelihood of exposure is less, and profit margins are smaller, and hence less information. But that doesn't change the fact that based on that minimum, that data set at 1 to 10 ton, you cannot do a screening level risk assessment. Thank you.
Okay, I'm just trying to find this question again, which has been moved in this document somehow. Oh yeah, there it is. Maybe this should go to Bjorn again, actually. No, this should be, maybe Sylvie would like to answer this. A question from Sonia saying, how can higher fines be introduced to improve implementation and maybe increase funding of ECHA? Because as I said before, the ones from industry who have done their homework should have a vested interest that those who have not done their homework and are indeed exploiting the system should be drawn for responsibility accordingly. What do you think of this, Sylvie?
So we agree there has to be a level playing field, and that the good students should be rewarded somehow, or the bad students punished somehow. We're kind of bound together with this CEF, so with the joint registration when it comes to generating data. So if it's about data, we're very much bound together, and I can tell you that it's extremely difficult, and it takes a lot of energy and resources when you have, I don't know, 200, 300 sometimes people having to agree on spending money and doing the right amount of testing, and that there's a lot of discussion happening behind the scene that is not always visible. But fines, fines should be. I mean, there's a principle of proportionality. It should be proportionate to the level of negligence somehow. If we can find a system to discriminate somehow in the enforcement, the good from the not good students, that would be welcome in the spirit of level playing field. I think there's a role for the Commission here to also see how to align the different member states, because at the end, enforcement and fines is a member state's competence. So can there be more harmonization? What is the role of the enforcement forum? And there's something very novel with REACH, which is the enforcement authorities coming together to help enforce REACH and CLP, for example. this was very new, very welcome from our perspective, although it's a bit of a black box in terms of discussions. But still, I mean, can we build on that? Can there be? It's all about better harmonization and proportionate enforcement, and having a look at that, we support.
Okay, thank you, Sylvie. And the last question, I would like to bring in Ksenia Trier, who is from the European Environmental Agency, if I am not mistaken. Ksenia, I have given you the floor.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much to all the speakers for giving a very broad perspective today. Well, I would like to come back to the questions raised by both Bjorn Hansen, Sylvie Lemoine, and also by Peter Fanneke recently, that if we want to have this transition towards a safe and sustainable by design of chemicals and materials, which criteria are needed? And maybe you, Bjorn, could help share your thoughts on how you foresee who could lead this process. Also, if we already have or we need to develop the knowledge base for this, and which stakeholders should be involved in setting their criteria. And finally, the question will also be, which endpoints should such a safe and sustainable by design take into account with regards to human and environmental health? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Much of your question is answered by what does policy need? And that's what we're trying to read into currently a number of the Commission's communication strategies and agendas. Ultimately, it will be what Council, Parliament, and the Commission agree on as being what is needed. And that will dictate what is sustainable or not. In theory, of course, if you take the broadest of all definitions of sustainable, we need to do a complete life cycle analysis of all chemicals on the market, which requires that we collect all the exposure information that doesn't exist. We need to generate it because it doesn't exist. We need to collect, so much information that it's a vast amount of information. So clearly that is undoable. It will cost way too much. So there is some level of imperfection from a true scientific sustainability assessment of all chemicals that we will need to accept, and that's driven by policy demands. In my view, what I see currently, I think we as a technical scientific agency, could help tease out what are the factors that we think are the ones that would help policy go in the direction that they are saying, and then initiate a discussion with the policy level in terms of, have we found the right factors? Through those factors, are we measuring the things that are important? And then the policy side will say yes, no, or maybe, or you forgot this, or there's a comparison to be made here. And we would say, well, we can't compare. So what do you think? So have a dialogue. But I do think, based on the Commission document right now, there is substantial guidance for an agency like ours to sit down and at least at a relatively generic level, tease out what the factors could be and initiate a discussion. Which stakeholders need to be there? That again, all depends on policy. What is the policy objectives? Who do those policy objectives, achieving them, touch, et cetera, et cetera. But that would be my very generic answer to how I could see this moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Bjorn. And seeing that we have only 5 minutes left, I would like to try to make a little wrap up. We have really barely scraped at the surface of many issues and problems today. For example, we have not talked about plastic pollution, about the possibility to prevent future plastic pollution. We have not spoken about the problems of pharmaceuticals in the environment, because pharmaceuticals are exempted from REACH regulation, and therefore their effects on the environment are scarcely known. But of course, being pharmaceuticals, being intended to have an impact on the body of humans, it is pretty obvious that they will have an impact on the body of animals too, and also on plants maybe. So this is a huge field which has not yet been covered in EU legislation properly. I think what we have seen in the debate, I'm very, very glad that we see unity when it comes to the issue of the Green Deal, that everyone is standing behind the Green Deal saying, yes, we need to become a climate neutral continent. We need to become sustainable. We need to protect our biodiversity and our environment in order to be able to protect human health. As has been said at the very beginning by Virginijus, these issues are very closely linked. People living in a polluted environment generally have poorer health and are more will get ill sooner, for example, by COVID-19, but also by other diseases. We have this unity now, which we did not have in the 80s, for example, when I started to have an interest in chemical issues. There was a lot of opposition from industry saying, okay, these are just people who want to kill the economy, and on the other hand, we had the early Greens saying we don't need chemical industry at all. So I think both sides have moved a bit, but to see how the discussion has went today, I think the devil will be in the detail. How everyone thinks the Green Deal should be implemented, what should be part of it, what will we need in the future, what is indispensable when coming to a climate neutral industry, and what should be discarded. So I think the crucial thing is that we should work together on our way forward, because we need to have these debates over and over on many different issues. And there is no use if everyone sits in his or her own echo chamber and trying only to listen to people who have the same ideas than himself or herself, because we have to move towards this climate neutral, sustainable society, industry as a society. We'll need everyone on this way. And therefore, it's so important that we don't lose patience with one another and keep on having these debates, even if they are sometimes very difficult. Let me end with thanking everyone present here, making this event possible. Thanking all the participants, especially, of course, our panel, the two people who are absent now, Virginijus and Carole, who have very, very full agendas. But thank you very much, Bjorn, for being with us. Thank you, Sylvie, for making it possible at such a short notice. And thank you, Frida. It was an honor of having you all here. I'm very glad for this debate, and I hope that we will engage in the debate also in future. I would like to thank everyone who has listened for such a long time and has kept up his or her interest for more than 2 hours. Thanks for your questions and comments to our strategy and to the debate. And of course, thanks to our technical staff who has worked a lot in making this event possible and who has worked a lot here in the background, including the interpreters. And I would like to leave the very last words to my wonderful colleague Sven Giegold, without whom this conference probably wouldn't have taken place at all.
Okay, I didn't expect that. Thank you. So we will continue cooperating on this. So as I wrote in the chat, we are looking forward to personal discussions, online discussions, feedback in writing. On this, I would only like to say that the spirit of what we are doing is based on positivity and not negativity. We want to shape the future, but we are measuring what we have achieved by facts. And the facts are, we have no time left. The climate development is very clear. I've chosen today some healthy trees in the background. In Germany, we have dying forests on large part of our surface. And we have seen the pictures of the Amazon in Siberia. The warning signals are very clear. and this means it is important that so many people in the industry, in civil society, in science, in authorities are of best intentions, are doing their part. But what we are all doing together is simply not enough. And the Earth is showing us clearly what future generations expect. And this means we have to achieve in the results. And the results are very clear, were measured, as our children tell us, by science. And therefore, best intentions and all the steps are still not good enough. And therefore, let's work together in order to achieve what we are calling a green transition or a European Chemiewende for people and planet. And we will be around, Jutta and myself. Take it as an invitation, and therefore thank you to everybody who has participated. Looking forward to your comments, and in particular to an ambitious sustainable strategy, chemical strategy by the European Commission. Bye-bye.